People who are trained in the medical profession, like doctors or nurses, are trained to help people, not hurt them.
She had killed one of our hometown heroes.
When you have a .38 gun and you have hatred for somebody, bad things are going to happen.
She named her right before she died as the person who had shot her. She is referred to as the most hated woman in America.
Corpus Christi is a laid-back community. We're on the seaside, and it's a lot of water activities, water sports and everything. It's kind of got a small-town vibe to it. My name is Mark Skirka. At that time, I was called a chief prosecutor for the Nueces County District Attorney's Office. That afternoon, I was working at the district attorney's office when I heard there was a standoff at the Days Inn where somebody had been shot. I also heard that the suspect had been holding a gun against her head for several hours with the police and refusing to surrender.
The Friday afternoon it happened, I was contacted by my supervisor and dispatched to the scene of the shooting. My name is Ray Rivera Jr. I was a Corpus Christi police officer for 30 years. We lost a great person. She had killed one of our hometown heroes.
Selena Quintanilla was born on April the 16th, 1971. She was one of 3 siblings. I'm Dr. Joni Johnston, clinical and forensic psychologist and private investigator. She had a pretty musical family. Her dad had a restaurant for a period of time, but he noticed early on that his youngest daughter, Selena, had just this magical voice, and she began performing in the restaurant when she was 6 years old.
At the time, her dad had his own band, and then he basically made a band out of his own family. His son became the guitar player, his daughter became the drummer, and Selena became the singer.
As time went on, Selena was becoming more popular, not just here locally, but around the state. And then we started to learn she was just really popular nationwide.
She was incredibly famous during her reign. My name is Rod Demery, and I'm a retired homicide detective. She was a Latina singer, and people were wildly crazy about her music. I think her sort of a hybrid, you know, from American music to Latin music was really interesting. She had fans of all sorts, but particularly in the Latino community.
She became really the queen of Tejano music. And this was a form of music that was very, very popular in Mexican-American community, particularly in southern Texas, but it wasn't something that was necessarily widespread in the United States. And so it was so wonderful, I think, for her community to feel like this is somebody who is an up-and-coming star. She's representing us, and she's representing our culture, and she's representing our music.
Selena was a superstar in her fans' eyes. Selena had a God-given ability to sing and to bring entertainment to people from all walks of life.
She had such a sparkle about her, and her voice was so gifted.
She was a fantastic individual, a great young woman. Whoever met her liked her. She had a smile and a kind word for everybody. And that everybody just loved her. They thought the world of her. Boy, we could use more Selenas in this world.
Selena loved entertaining the public, loved singing, loved being on stage, but she had another secret passion. She loved to do fashion design. Most of her costumes were self-designed by her. She didn't have these highfalutin fashion designers following around. She came up with these ideas on her own and wanted to branch out into that field. Selena opened 2 boutiques, one in Corpus Christi, one in San Antonio. They sewed clothing, they gave hairdressing appointments, they did nails, they did all kinds of things for women. But Selena also had a sideline where she was trying to start a clothing line down in Mexico, and she worked with a fashion designer from there to help bring that clothing line into existence. Well, things were sailing along pretty well with the businesses, and Selena's career was just increasing and increasing. And Selena's dad started hearing things. He heard things like people were not getting the stuff they were supposed to get from the fan club. Essentially, like you sent in your money and you were supposed to get like a signed picture from Selena or some membership card. He was getting complaints that people were not receiving what they'd been promised. He was very concerned about this because as he knew that if you get mad at the fan club, that may make you mad at Selena. He realized something was up and something didn't smell right.
We'll never know exactly what happened in that room, but Selena decides to leave. She gets up and she's walking to the door.
As Selena was walking out the door, she was shot in the back.
After being shot, Selena ran from the hotel room. She ran across a grassy area toward the office. She dropped her cell phone. She dropped the briefcase full of folders in her haste to get away. As she's rounding the pool area, she drops her purse. Selena is running away with a gunshot wound to her back. She gets into the office where she collapses on the floor.
Since the bullet hit an artery, she bled out very, very quickly.
One of the front desk clerks come over and said, "Who shot you? Who shot you?" And Selena, with her dying breath, tells her, "Yolanda, room 158.
Yolanda Saldivar was from San Antonio, born and raised in San Antonio, came from a large family.
She was the youngest of 7 siblings. She was also very small and a little bit on the heavier side. And we all know how painful that can be when you stand out in any way in school. So she was subjected to quite a bit of bullying growing up. And she also, I think, was somewhat of a loner. She was very smart. She did well in school, academically, but I think socially she was pretty isolated. I think her family was pretty close-knit. They loved each other, but there were a lot of financial struggles. Even though Yolanda was young, and it would have been very difficult financially for her, she actually took in those 3 children and really considered them her own. And I think that really added just a huge responsibility to her, and probably a lot of stress as well, because she's trying to figure out her own career, her own life, and at the same time, she's this kind of instant mom to 3 young children. After this happened, Yolanda decided that she wanted to become a nurse.
Most people that get into nursing, healthcare, is because they genuinely feel the need to care for people. Nurses in particular. That's pretty evident in Yolanda.
She spent several years balancing nursing school with taking care of her 3 charges. At the age of 30, she completes her nursing degree and she begins working as a nurse, and that seems to be going well for a while. But I think there was a part of Yolanda that really wanted to have more fun. One of the things that Yolanda really clung to, no matter how tight finances were, is she seemed to really, really love live music. It was through this that she ended up attending a Selena concert. She just is enamored with her and wants to be a part of her life in some way.
After one of the concerts one time, Selena's dad, Abraham Quintanilla, was approached by Yolanda Saldivar and asked if she could start a Selena fan club. At the time, Selena's dad thought, great. I mean, this is a way to get my daughter more exposure, the band more exposure, get her name out there and stuff. So he readily agreed to let Yolanda Saldivar start a fan club for Selena.
I certainly think that knowing that Yolanda had been a nurse would have been something that would be reassuring. You would kind of be like, yeah, this is a person who is responsible, who's self-disciplined, who's a nurturer, and who is trustworthy, because these are all the qualities we tend to imbue in nurses.
I believe Yolanda wanted to start a fan club for Selena because it put her, Yolanda, in the spotlight. People would be around, people would like her, people would want to talk to her. She liked the publicity, the limelight, the glamour.
The relationship was actually a business relationship, and I think in Yolanda's mind, she probably felt they were a lot closer, probably felt part of the family. So I think it made her, or did a great deal for her esteem and a great deal for her sort of self-worth when she thought she was part of that group, that family.
I think what develops almost as a big sister, little sister relationship, where I think Selena starts relying on Yolanda. She isn't around a lot of people outside of her family. And so she and Yolanda start becoming very, very good friends. And Selena, I think, begins confiding in her. And she then ultimately asked Yolanda to work for her for money. You know, she basically says, oh, you've done a great job with this fan club. Would you become my personal assistant? And Yolanda, I think this is a dream come true for her. And so she quits her nursing job and dedicates all of her time to being with Selena, helping Selena. And then it becomes even more expanded when Selena decides to open some clothing boutiques, which is a real passion for her. And she asked Yolanda to help manage these clothing stores. And so what happens over time is you have somebody who started out as a fan club volunteer, basically, and has become an integral part of Selena's life.
She had access to Selena's credit cards. She had the power to make contracts and make business deals. She had the power to run the boutiques and do whatever she needed to do with the employees or the merchandise at the boutiques. In fact, she just had pretty much everything. Yolanda Saldivar and Selena were almost inseparable. They would give each other gifts. Selena trusted her implicitly.
I think for Yolanda, she has finally achieved a dream of hers, which is to be needed by somebody who is special and powerful and a star. And I think that that gave Yolanda this sense of self-esteem. I think it filled a hole that she had in her. I would imagine there were times when she looked back and thought, wow, you know, here I was, 4 feet 9 inches tall, a little bit chubby, being bullied by all these classmates, you know, being left out, not having any friends. Look at me now. You know, I am one of the closest friends to one of the rising superstars in music. And I think she absolutely loved everything about it. I think if Yolanda had been 15, 16 years old, parents are going to into a room of a teenager and seeing a life-size cutout of Selena in the room and posters everywhere, they think, wow, you know, my daughter is really a fan, you know, a super fan. I think for a 30-something-year-old woman to have essentially a shrine to the person that she really is working for, I think it does speak to how central Selena was to, in some respects, her emotional well-being. I think it just reflects that this was her world. There would be no doubt walking into Yolanda's home that Selena was the most important person in her life.
Selena's father was very concerned about money being taken from the fan club.
He realized that something was happening. Money had been missing from the fan club. People weren't getting their stuff. He was getting all these complaints, but he didn't know exactly what was happening at that time.
Eventually, Selena's father realizes that Yolanda has taken quite a bit of money, upwards of $30,000. So he decides that he's going to call a meeting with the family and Yolanda and confront her with it.
When Abraham Quintanilla confronted her to her face, something's going on, people are complaining about that. Yolanda Saldivar always had an explanation. Oh, Mr. Quintanilla, they're trying to get more than what they paid for. Oh, Mr. Quintanilla, I did send them the picture. Oh, Mr. Quintanilla, they're just lying about that because they want more stuff. She always had an excuse for everything.
I find it shocking when anyone steals from somebody that trusts them, that cares for them, that believes in them, that becomes friends with them. That is shocking.
Even though Selena is loyal to Yolanda, she's not willing to ignore everything. I mean, she's somebody who is responsive to reason. I think she still cares about Yolanda at this point, for sure, but I think she starts realizing that Yolanda has made some mistakes. And so I think that while Selena probably still loved Yolanda, she was starting to not trust her. When Selena starts asking for those documents, I think perhaps the way Yolanda interpreted that is, does Selena care about me still? Is she still loyal to me? Or is she trying to appease me until she gets these documents? And then when she gets them, she's going to exit. She's going to fire me. She's going to, basically not be my friend anymore. And so she becomes very reluctant to give up those documents because I think for her, it's a way to hold on to Selena.
On March 30th, Selena Quintanilla drove over to the Days Inn to meet Yolanda Saldivar in her hotel room, ostensibly to get the records back.
As part of their discussions, Yolanda tells her something horrible happened when I was in Mexico on business. I was raped by 2 men. And Selena is just very supportive of her. She's distressed by this. The next morning, Yolanda calls Selena and says, I need to go to the hospital and get checked out.
Selena, being the nice person she was, went over there and took her to the hospital. When they returned back to the motel, both of them went inside the hotel room.
An argument began. Shortly after that, Selena was shot.
Yolanda Saldivar retreated into the hotel room, came out a minute later with a towel wrapped around the gun, and went into a red truck that was parked there.
As it turned out, there was a police unit just 2 or 3 blocks from the motel. That police officer arrived. As he's pulling into the driveway of the motel, Yolanda was attempting to exit the motel.
There was 2 uniformed policemen that tried to get her out of the car, tried to get her to surrender.
She refused to exit the vehicle, kept claiming she was going to shoot herself.
There was a real possibility that she was going to pull that trigger and end her own life.
She doesn't want to give up. She threatens suicide. She makes all kinds of accusations about different people and who's responsible for what.
And then the hostage negotiation team took over. After an hour or 2, she apparently was able to hear on the radio inside the truck that Selena was dead. She really lost it then and kept threatening to kill herself. The hostage negotiators kept trying to calm her down, to have her give herself up and not kill herself, which they finally accomplished after some 8 or 9 hours. And they took her immediately to the police department to be questioned.
Yolanda kept claiming she did not mean to do it, that it was an accident, it shouldn't have happened. From what we saw in the motel room, what we learned about missing money, it became apparent it was not an accident.
This lovely, beautiful, talented, up-and-coming star who everybody loved had been taken away at the age of 23. Nobody could understand that.
It has to be a devastating loss. The community took it as a loss. We lost a great person, a fantastic person, and that's just a tragedy to lose somebody like this.
50,000 people at least showed up to pay respects to her when she died. And I think the thirst from her fans for some justice and sometimes vengeance, I think was incredible.
The magnitude of this case was higher than any other case I had tried before. I mean, right after the killing, we had, a bunch of satellite trucks and people from everywhere, journalists from everywhere, interviewing us about this case. Remember that this was shortly after the O.J. Simpson case and the verdict that some people were quite dissatisfied with had just happened. So we felt like the spotlight was on us to do a good job.
The pressure is that when you have someone that iconic, then any mistake you make is going to be highlighted. Everybody's watching, so the pressure is immense.
The biggest challenge in the investigation was to prove that Yolanda Saldivar committed murder. Not that she shot Selena. Everybody was aware of that, but she committed murder, that it was not an accident.
In a homicide, you have to prove an intentional killing. It couldn't have been an accident. In this case, it was clear to me that it wasn't an accident because of what she had done before and after the killing.
From witnesses, we learned that there was an argument in the room and that they had seen Yolanda Saldivar step out of the room with a pistol still in her hand.
She follows Selena out the door, raises her gun hand out like this, and it seems like she's going to shoot Selena again. However, by this time, Selena has already gotten away. But she does say one last thing to Selena, the word. She calls her and then retreats into the hotel room. Did she call 911? Did she call the police? No. What she did was hide her gun, wrap it in a towel, and try to flee the scene. This is a person that's not acting as an accident happened. She's a nurse, for God's sake. She didn't even try to give first aid to Selena.
She knows how to save lives. In fact, if she wanted to save her life, she absolutely could have. Selena died from blood loss. Surely, as a nurse, one of the first things you know how to do is to stop blood loss.
Here's a person that then gets into the truck and tries to flee the scene. Does that sound like an accident to you?
It was very important that we learned that Selena had mentioned the name of the person that shot her. She was able to identify that individual.
Selena was the best witness. I mean, she named her right before she died as the person who had shot her.
After the shooting of Selena Quintanilla, the police, in doing their investigation of the crime scene and the murder itself, also did some more background into the finances and see what other things that might have been out of place with Yolanda Saldivar. The detective was able to find certain areas of financial improprieties in there, where, say, a radio station had been paid so much money, but Yolanda kept a cut of it. Somebody was supposed to get so much money, but Yolanda kept a cut of it. So there was a lot of discrepancies in the amount of thousands of dollars. Here she had access to money, power, stature, reputation. But when Selena fired her and Selena walked out that door, Yolanda Saldivar's life walked out that door, and she couldn't handle it.
Yolanda shot Selena because Selena was going to tell her dad something to the effect of, "You're taking money from us, you've been stealing money, we're going to call the police." Yolanda did not want to go to jail.
She began working for a private dermatology clinic, and that went well at the beginning, but ultimately her employer began noticing that some of the books were not exactly lining up.
The office manager had been on leave for several months, taking care of her sick mother. When she came back, she found that Yolanda Saldivar had been doing the books, in fact, had been embezzling from the company.
They did an investigation and found out that Yolanda had stolen over $9,000.
I think the doctor saw that as quite a betrayal.
When you turn on people that are your friends, that care for you, that have helped you out, that's just wrong.
The nurses come out and basically say, you know, we examined Yolanda. We don't see any physical evidence of any kind of sexual assault. I think it's really important to note that false rape allegations are extremely rare. When that happens, it's usually for a couple of different reasons. It's kind of a manipulative attempt to be seen as a victim. I certainly think in Yolanda's case, it was also a diversion. So this is going to take the focus off of all these other issues we have between us, and this is going to unite us in terms of me being a sexual assault victim and you being a friend who's supporting me during this time. Yolanda had really taken a big gamble by reporting this rape, and Selena felt incredibly betrayed and hurt by this.
Selena had been given Yolanda Saldivar the benefit of the doubt, but could no longer do so because she was telling too many stories. Selena knew she was going to fire her, and by this time, Yolanda Saldivar knew it too. She picks out the gun. She has to sign a declaration of intent to buy a handgun. She does that. 2 days later, she comes back and finishes paying off the gun and gets the gun.
I think that she was incredibly worried, anxious, distressed, and panicked at the thought of losing this relationship. And I think she thought it can go one of two ways, right? It can go where we repair this relationship, I somehow magically repair this and we're just back to where we were. Or our relationship ends and I am going to do something drastic. I am not going to allow Selena to walk away from me.
Yolanda Saldivar may not have been a physically imposing person, but when you have a .38 gun and you have hatred for somebody, bad things are going to happen.
At the police building, I met with Yolanda Saldivar. I asked her, Yolanda, it wasn't an accident. You shot her because you were mad. You shot her out of anger because you were about to get caught stealing money. And in Spanish, the term is fue de coraje. To me, that means it was because out of anger, out of rage. She put her head down, started to cry a bit, and nodded yes, and told me in Spanish, sí, señor, yes. I then stated to her, I remember this, Yolanda, that's very important. We need to get it in your statement. We need to put this down. She shook her head and says, nope, no, señor, it's not going in. She became aware if she put that down in writing, for sure she was going to get convicted of murder, of killing Selena, and end up in the penitentiary for a long time.
We knew it wasn't an accident. We had to prove in this case that Yolanda Saldivar intentionally tried to kill Selena Quintanilla. That was a thing that we had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
I think that there were people who absolutely were not only outraged, but counting the days until Yolanda went to trial. I heard her referred to back in the day as the most hated woman in America. I heard somebody say that because people were so angry.
It seemed to be at that time, shortly before the trial, the public here in Corpus Christi wanted Yolanda Saldivar to be convicted. They didn't care for her, they didn't like it. She had killed one of our hometown heroes.
Prosecution argued that Yolanda had systematically planned to murder Selena. And they talked about the gun, the fact that she had called her over that day and asked her to come alone, the fact that Selena was shot in the back, the fact that witnesses reported seeing Yolanda as Selena is leaving walk out the door with her gun raised again to Selena and calling her a
Despite her so-called love of Selena, the last thing she says to her best friend is, I mean, those are the keys that I harped on with the jury to show that this was an intentional killing and not an accident.
The defense's argument was that it was an accident, that she had intended to kill herself, and that she had a gun in her purse, and that when Selena came to see her and they were talking, she became very distraught and became so distraught that she picked up the gun and she put it to her head. And that Selena was trying to kind of wrestle the gun away from her or take it away from her, the gun accidentally goes off and shoots Selena.
We proved that the gun would not go off accidentally. We had a gun expert look at the gun and show that it would not go accidentally. Yolanda Saldivar stared stone-faced. When the evidence came in front of her, the witness came in front of her, she was impassive. After a very short time in deliberations, the jury came back and found her guilty as charged of first-degree murder. And the jury ended up giving her life in prison. When the judge imposed the sentence on her after the judgment of the jury, Yolanda Saldivar did not visibly react.
Yolanda never showed remorse. She never apologized, to use that word, for shooting Selena. It felt good to get a guilty verdict, to know that we had done the right thing, that we were correct in our investigation.
Selena's family reacted emotionally, but quietly. Here was a hollow victory. They had gotten the maximum punishment on this person who had taken their beloved daughter, sister, wife away from them. And it had to have been a good feeling, but it's hard to feel good about a sentence when you know your loved one will never come back.
I think Yolanda was an obsessed fan. I think it was her personality. I think that's just who she is. She wants to be in someone's life, even if that person doesn't want them in their life. And if she gets dismissed, she's going to kill him or kill herself.
We see somebody, I think, who started out as a super fan, who morphed into more of a personal relationship. And so I think by the time that she ends up killing Selena, it's not an obsessive fan killing her idol. It is a combination of, I think, a sense of betrayal in a real relationship and a disgruntled employee who feels like she has been wronged in spite of all the evidence suggesting that she's the one doing the wrong.
It amazes me that a nurse would even go to that form of violence. I mean, people are trained in the medical profession, like doctors or nurses, are trained to help people, not hurt them. And to kill somebody has got to be the worst thing imaginable for somebody with that loyalty or oath to the medical profession. it's got to be a big betrayal.
It's interesting because people that choose those noble sort of professions, whether it's nursing or being a priest, yeah, sometimes they're just a wolf in sheep's clothing. The natural assumption is you're a nurse, you want to help people, you want to care for people, you're a very nurturing person. But they are sometimes worse.
The loss of Selena to her family is immeasurable. Her family has the most precious thing taken away from them. The pain in her heart is indescribable.
To the people that know Selena, what has been lost is her smile, her courage, her kindness to the community. People miss that. To this day, they still enjoy her music.
In 1995, after she died, her family started a foundation. The mission of this foundation is to really help children and help them develop and be the person they're meant to be. And I love the fact that one of their lines is, to help children sing whatever song they're meant to sing.
I think Selena's legacy continues, and I think there's probably a lot of barriers that have been knocked down because of her existence.
She has not died in spirit from our culture. She's very much alive, I think, and that is a legacy and tribute to what she did when she was alive.
People still wonder how big Selena would have eventually been. She was on the cusp of superstardom. Everybody wonders what could have been if we had her music to enjoy, and what would have happened if she hadn't been tragically cut down in the prime of her life.
As a dentist, not only was he looked up to, he was a figure of authority.
Whatever was going on, you could bet that Colin Howell would be there, either leading it or right at the very heart of it. She was a young woman who was looking for excitement.
A town like Coleraine, it's very hard to keep an affair like that a secret.
He thought he was extremely clever.
No one would have any reason to suspect anything other than suicide.
My name is Mandy Macaulay, and I'm an investigative journalist for the BBC. I'll never forget it. We were sitting in the office one afternoon. It was a very wet, dark January day, and a call came through to the newsroom. You could not have made this story up. It had everything. If you had set out to write an epic drama, it had sex, lust, Christianity, money, betrayal, deceit, and ultimately death. It just wrote itself.
I'm Peter Winter. I'm a reporter with the Coleraine Chronicle. It wasn't the typical case because most murders occur on the margins of society. This involved two very respectable middle-class families, church-going, God-fearing people who were well respected in the local area.
We just sat there in complete shock and disbelief. A very well-known, very high-profile dentist had just walked in to a police station in Coleraine and had confessed to murdering his first wife and also the husband of his former lover.
Colerane's a provincial town about 55 miles north of Belfast, quite close to the beautiful north coast of Northern Ireland.
It's dotted with, you know, upmarket wine bars and restaurants, and I mean, really an absolutely stunning setting.
It's fairly close-knit. People know each other's business a lot of the time.
Everyone loved Colin Hoyle. Colin Hoyle was extremely charismatic, very chatty. He threw himself into everything. I remember someone saying to me, Colin Hoyle was the kind of guy that every mother wanted their daughter to marry because he was so successful, so charming, and he also was a committed Christian. Colin Hoyle grew up in Portadown in County Armagh. He went to Queen's University where he was singled out very early on as a high flyer in the world of dentistry. He went into cosmetic implant dentistry. He was a man who was focused, I'm told, who knew what he wanted, and he wanted to be successful.
That's where he met his future wife, Leslie Clark, as she was then. She was a nurse at the local hospital in Belfast.
Leslie was a very natural beauty, very ethereal, very soft. You know, people talk about her melodic voice, that she lit up a room.
At a fairly early stage before they were married, she got pregnant. Now, that must have been really tough for her as a religious person. Colin is very worried about the impact on him of having a baby out of wedlock before marriage, so he encouraged her to have an abortion.
An outsider looking in would have seen a very successful, very charming, very loved up couple. A couple who were going places. He was a youth leader in the local church, so whatever was going on, you could bet that Colin Hoyle would be there, either leading it or right at the very heart of it. Leslie was very, very popular among the other mothers and had lots of friends.
They moved from place to place, always socially, upwardly mobile, moving to bigger houses, better areas, and so on. My feeling is that a lot of this was for show, or because Colin was chasing status, as in putting themselves in financial peril by pushing beyond his means when they bought their latest house. A sense that he just felt that it was so important that he was admired, so important that he had social standing.
There was very much two sides to Colin Hoyle. There was the very charismatic Colin. He was also quite an arrogant man, but also very, very dark moods that would flicker to the surface every now and then. Hazel and Colin's affair began when they were both teachers in the Sunday school in Korean Baptist Church. Hazel was teaching young children there, and Colin was a youth leader. And quite literally, their eyes met across the room.
For a man like Colin, perhaps, for him having a woman who desired him over and above his wife, if he's a narcissist, would have been important to him.
At that stage, Leslie was heavily pregnant with her youngest child. So while she was resting at home, Hazel and Colin were becoming closer, taking the children to the local swimming pool for lessons. And by the summer of 1990, they were caught up in a full-blown affair.
I don't think it's any coincidence that Colin's affair with Hazel began around about the same time that they were having money problems. For somebody like Colin, being in financial distress is going to be far more of a slur on his manhood, if you like, than it might be for other people. He believes himself to be superior to everybody else. He believes that he should be treated differently because he is better than everybody else. So having financial problems is going to have a huge impact on his self-esteem. It may well be that his affair with Hazel was part of getting over that, making himself feel better, making himself feel more of a man.
She met her future husband Trevor at a very early age, and the pair got married and moved to Coleraine, where Trevor, who was a policeman, had been posted. Trevor Buchanan was seen as a solid, dependable type who'd worked hard to get his dream job in the police.
Trevor was the very antithesis of Colin Howell. Colin Howell had to be in the centre of everything, whereas Trevor was a very funny guy, dedicated to his family, incredibly decent, and had lots of friends, and he was happy with that. I think that by her mid-20s, Hazel was growing very restless and very dissatisfied in her marriage. She had had her 2 children very quickly after the marriage, and I think that by the time she met Colin Howell, I have been told that she was a young woman who was looking for excitement, who felt that there was something missing from her life.
A town like Coleraine, it's very hard to keep an affair like that a secret. They would go to sort of local beauty spots, but there was always a risk that they'd be seen by somebody who knew them. Anyone who lives in a small town knows that the chances of bumping into someone you know are always pretty high.
What matters to Colin Howell is what other people think about him. And so long as that's pristine, so long as that is beyond criticism, he's happy. And so he will do things for appearance's sake.
During the course of his affair with Hazel, Colin persuaded her to have an abortion, exactly as he'd done with his wife before their marriage. And that speaks to this idea that he does not want to be found out, that outward appearance of him being the perfect family man, the perfect successful dentist, was more important to him than anything else.
I am Professor Donna Youngs. I am a professor of investigative psychology at Northumbria University. As a dentist, not only was he looked up to, he was a figure of authority, just compounding the sense of superiority, which I think was part of his personality.
She actually went to her church pastor in an extremely distressed state and said, look, there's something not right in my marriage. I think Colin's having an affair. And the pastor confronted Colin and he point blank denied it. But eventually, Hazel did confess, and Leslie and Trevor were both told about what had been going on. Leslie was absolutely devastated, but determined to make her marriage work. And Trevor, also absolutely heartbroken, but he too wanted the marriage to continue.
The Baptist Church did their best to console the couples and try and put a stop to it.
The pastor was delighted. Colin and Hazel had sought forgiveness. Leslie and Trevor had forgiven them, and all four were moving on with their lives. But Colin and Hazel just could not keep away from each other, and they very quickly resumed the affair behind their partners' backs. At night, Colin would go running through Mount Sandal Forest, which backed onto Hazel and Trevor's house. And while Trevor was out on night duty as a police officer, Colin would go into Hazel's house and they would spend time together, and then he would leave in the early hours. At that time, he was drugging Leslie with red wine and with tablets so that she wouldn't realise just how much time he was spending away from the house in the early hours of the morning.
She was absolutely devastated by this. By all accounts, they had a very close relationship. It must have been a terribly difficult time for her, and therefore it's not really surprising that she did turn to alcohol and drugs.
At one stage, Leslie becomes so unhappy that she actually takes an overdose of tablets, and she's rushed to hospital, and she survives and is very remorseful, and she tells her friends that she could never leave her children and she will never do it again.
It seemed very much that this was a cry for help, but she did write a suicide note.
He began to think that night, well, what would have happened if Leslie had died? What would have happened if she hadn't come home from the hospital, if she hadn't survived the overdose? My life might have been so much better.
He told Hazel about it one night at a local beauty spot. He gave her 4 specific jobs to do, and that as long as she was able to do those jobs, then he hoped they would be in the clear.
I think it's so interesting that in advance of committing the murders, Colin tells Hazel that what he's planning to do. I think it tells us so much about the dynamic of their relationship, about how much he dominates the whole of the relationship, and doesn't question the fact that she will submit to that beyond every other source of authority. For her, his authority trumps the police, trumps the community, trumps the courts, it even trumps the church.
Leslie, in the early evening, was going in and out of consciousness on the sofa in the lounge. She had been drinking red wine. She had also taken some prescription drugs.
He gave her a sedative to ensure that she was asleep.
Colin, as a dentist, there's no question that he would have had access to drugs, including tranquilizers and including sleeping tablets.
Powell barricaded his children into their bedrooms, and once he knew that they were secure, he set about putting his murder plan in motion.
He went to his car, he attached a hose pipe from the exhaust of the car and ran it into the room where she was asleep.
Hoyle took his baby's feeding bottle and he cut the top off it and he connected it to a hose. He put the nozzle of the baby's feeding bottle up to her mouth and started to gas her.
Carbon monoxide is a very effective way of killing people. You will, to begin with, feel generally unwell, feel drowsy, feel sick, feel headachy. But within a very short space of time, if you're exposed to a lot of carbon monoxide, you will become unconscious.
For most killers, there is a point when they have to look into the eyes of the person they are murdering. That's not something Colin Howell was able to do. He wanted to avoid judgment, even as he killed his wife. And I think there's a sense in which, if that murderous moment of encounter doesn't happen, I think in Colin Howell's mind, in some ways, the murder doesn't happen.
He carried Leslie to the car and put her in the boot, covered her with a blanket, gathered a few things, photographs, a tape recorder with a tape that had gospel music on it, and drove across town to Hazel's house, where Hazel was waiting for him.
This is one of the roads that Colin Hoyle travelled that night. It's hard to imagine what he must have been thinking. He had his wife's body dumped in the boot. He later said he was terrified that he would get stopped by police. And so he was driving very slowly.
When he arrived, he was annoyed that Hazel had not already opened the garage. That had been part of the plan. She had been standing at the window, but she hadn't had everything ready for him for his arrival.
When Hoyle arrived, Trevor was lying, drifting in and out of consciousness in his bedroom. Hazel was sent by Hoyle into a room where she hid while he turned on the ignition again of the car in the garage and again fed the hose pipe through to Trevor's bedroom. He held it up to Trevor's mouth and realised that Trevor wasn't asleep, he wasn't unconscious, and that he was going to fight for his life, which Trevor did.
He jumped on the bed, took the hose and thrust it directly into Trevor's mouth. Now at that point, Trevor awoke and a struggle ensued. But he was in a drugged state and he was no match for Colin, who was fit and healthy as it was. And he was on top of him, astride him. He kept the hose in his mouth and waited until the body went lifeless.
We're talking about somebody who in his everyday life is used to controlling people and then doing things to them. And I think in his mind, this would just have been an extension of that.
Colin had given Hazel a series of orders. He told her to prepare clothes in which he could dress the body. And after he'd finished, he told her that she was to dispose of the hose pipe that had been used for the murder.
Presenting as a suicide is a cowardly approach to murder. It's a way of trying to set it up so that the blame can be passed from him, not just to avoid detection, but to set up a story that that's what's really happened.
At just after 3 a.m, Colin had left Hazel's house and he was driving along this road with not one but two bodies in the boot. Feels so strange being back here all these years later. I think it's only now that you realise just how stunning this little village is and how obscene it is that Colin Howell drove up this road with the bodies of his wife and his lover's husband in the boot. Such evil in a place that is just so tranquil.
He drove the car into the garage, he left Leslie in the boot, and he moved Trevor to the front seat.
Trevor was quite tall, so Howell had quite a few problems getting him into the driver's seat, and he actually had to leave Trevor's leg or his knee wedged in the driver's seat door. This man was so arrogant that he even had a photograph of himself with Leslie in a beautiful silver frame placed beside her body. I mean, he really did think that he had staged and dressed the scene right down to the very last detail.
He placed headphones on her head and pressed play on a cassette player which contained a cassette with gospel music.
I think the complexity, the elaborateness of the plan is an indication of the way that he's not really admitting to himself that he's committing simple, straightforward murder.
He picked up his bike that he'd stashed on the hedge, and then he cycled back to Coleraine with literally only about 2 hours to spare until it was morning. His children were still barricaded in their bedrooms. He checked that they were okay. He burnt the clothes, he burnt the surgical gloves and the sheets. He rang Hazel to tell her that he had made it safely home. And then he set about his cover.
Colin calls the church elders. He says his wife is missing. So the elders of the church go looking. In due course, they discover the car with the bodies of Leslie and Trevor. There was an exhaust pipe, a pipe piping carbon monoxide into the car.
The police were called and they examined the scene, but to all intents and purposes, it looked like a suicide. The fact that the door of the car was still open with Trevor's leg hanging out of it, the fact that Leslie was in the boot of the car, why would she be in the boot?
Trevor had blood on his sweatshirt. This just didn't seem to quite fit. Normally, if you have a couple who make a decision to commit suicide in a car using carbon monoxide, you'd expect them to have been sitting together, perhaps holding hands for comfort.
Colin had perhaps relied on the fact that a pathologist's report would undoubtedly find that the pair had been poisoned by carbon monoxide. Given the background to the case and the upset that his wife and his lover's husband were clearly going through.
Hazel tells police that the previous night she had been awakened from her sleep by noises from the kitchen. It had been Trevor and Leslie. They had sounded very distressed. It added to the narrative that Leslie and Trevor were together the previous night, but also that they were extremely distressed by the affair. Leslie had said, you know, I can't take any more, I'm going to sleep now, and if I wake up in the morning, let this be our secret. But in actual fact, the note that Colin had produced was one that Leslie had written months earlier, when she had discovered that her husband and Hazel were continuing their sexual relationship behind her back. I think that Colin Howell had a very high opinion of himself. He thought he was extremely clever, and yes, he thought that he was clever enough and smart enough to get away with a perfect murder.
Colin and Hazel both gave evidence, and they spoke of their unhappy marriages and how they'd met, had an affair, and were shocked at the fact that their spouses had taken their own lives.
There's no question that Leslie's death solved a lot of problems for Colin. Firstly, she was out of the way, as it were. This would allow him to continue his affair with Hazel. But in addition, there was some financial gain for him. He did have an insurance policy, which was a lot of money. It was about £400,000. And in addition, her father had only recently died, so she, of course, would have inherited money from her father, which, on her death, would have gone to her husband.
The affair continued for about 5 years after the deaths of their husband and wife.
Perhaps one of the greatest ironies is that it wasn't Colin who left Hazel. It was actually Hazel who left Colin. Hazel went on to marry a retired chief inspector in the police and had a very good, very affluent lifestyle for many years. Colin met an American divorcee. She had come to Northern Ireland from America, where she had fled an abusive relationship. She had 2 young children, and within 11 months they were married, and they went on to have 5 children. Using the money that he had made from Leslie's death, he went on to not only rescue his dental practice, but to forge a very, very successful international cosmetic dental practice. They would holiday around the world in the most luxurious spots, and by all accounts, Howell was living the high life.
He tells his new wife that he and Hazel murdered their respective partners and made it look like a suicide.
To me, it feels as if it's a slightly false confession, in that I think he is absolutely confident in his wife that it will not go beyond her. That means that he can offload this thing that has been worrying him.
This confession must have weighed incredibly heavily on her. Why he told her at that stage and then refused to allow her to tell anyone else, we don't know. Perhaps it was because he had no compassion towards her, and indeed he had no sense of the huge burden that it would place on her.
He'd invested in a crazy scheme to recover World War II gold that had been stashed in the Philippines by the Japanese, apparently. And unsurprisingly, he discovered that he'd been scammed, and he lost over £350,000.
Colin was convinced that God had punished him for what he did to Leslie and Trevor by killing his beloved oldest son, and that now that he had fallen out of favour with God. He felt that he had no other option but to confess to what he'd done and to hand himself in. Colin Howell was determined from the moment he walked into the police station in 2009 that he was going to implicate his former lover, and that if his life was going to come crashing down, then Hazel Stewart's life was going to come down too. The detail that he shared with police was eye-watering. He literally went through everything, every detail of the affair, the lead up to the murder, the cover-up, everything. This really was a man who, for some reason, wanted to unburden himself. Colin Howell wanted the world to know exactly who he was, what he was, and just how awful and heinous he'd been. He did not spare Hazel. Right from the get-go, he implicated her every step of the way. Police came to her home. They told her what she'd been accused of, and her world came crashing down. By pleading guilty, Howell ensured that Hazel would be the one who would have to stand in the dock and face the public wrath. Some people have said that Colin never recovered from Hazel rejecting him, and that in many ways this was his ultimate revenge.
The trial of Hazel Stewart was scheduled to last about 3 weeks.
This was the biggest and most sensational murder trial in Northern Ireland's history. I have never, either before or since, experienced anything like the anticipation and the drama that surrounded it.
Throughout Coleraine, there was a dark fascination over this case. People wanted to know as much as possible about what had happened.
I'm just standing yards from the road where Hazel lived at the time of the murders. The last time I stood in this spot, it was thronged with media, journalists. We were all trying to get a shot of Hazel and the children as he went to and from the court for the trial. It seems so strange now. It's so lovely and quiet and just a beautiful residential area.
That was a big moment in the trial. Everyone wanted to see this guy. He hadn't been in public since his arrest. He'd been remanded in custody and had gone straight to prison after his guilty plea. But here he was in Coleraine Courthouse with the nation's media upon him.
Colin painted a picture of Hazel as a woman who may have appeared as if butter didn't melt, but actually wasn't as innocent as she seemed. That was the message that he wanted to get across to the jury. And at every twist and every stage of his testimony, it was very much, she may not have been a willing participant, but she was right there every step of the way.
He came across as arrogant. He spoke about his knowledge of forensics, which he had learnt during his study of dentistry. He spoke about thinking meticulously about the plan and being sure that it would work. The defence strategy was to paint Howell as a super intelligent, manipulative and controlling person who had swept her along against her will to do things that she wouldn't otherwise have done.
I think Colin Howell was exposed for what he really was at that trial, and that was an extremely arrogant, self-centered showman, and I think the jury saw that quite clearly.
That was the week in which the jury heard the tapes of Hazel's police interviews. The police interviews were, in my opinion, a masterclass in interrogation.
You could have heard a pin drop in the courtroom whenever Hazel's tapes were played. Because I think up until that moment, a lot of people, women in particular, wanted to believe that Hazel was a victim, that Hazel was a woman who had been coerced, and that she wasn't a bad person. There was a very dramatic moment in the police interviews where she says, look, one night Colin said to me, Hazel, there is a way. And I said, what is it? And he said, well, we could kill them. And she said, oh, I was terrified. But it was at that moment that it was very obvious that Hazel knew that Colin was intending to kill both Leslie and Trevor.
Detective Sergeant Jeff Ferris conducted most of the interviews, and he was able to draw out confessions that she knew of the plot, that she'd sedated her husband, that she knew Howell was coming, that she opened the door to him, that she knew Leslie was dead in the boot, and that she'd provided clothes, and that she'd destroyed evidence. She'd burnt the hose that had been used to poison both her husband and his wife.
And I think when people heard the confession, heard that she knew what Colin was about to do, and that she had not made any attempt to save either Leslie or Trevor, I think they were really stunned, and a lot of people recoiled from them. It was just unbelievable to listen to them in court. And there was Hazel, sitting silently in the dock, just looking straight ahead of her.
One of the last admissions that Jeff Ferris was able to draw out of her was that she could have stopped the plot from happening. She told him that I could have stopped it. I could have stopped it. She repeated it twice. The judge had asked the jury to determine whether Hazel and Howell were in this together.
Hazel had tried to convince the jury that she was also a victim of Colin Howell. They didn't believe her.
The judge said that she had shown very little remorse. In fact, he said that the only remorse she'd shown was about the fact that she'd been caught. The judge was clear that of the two, Howell was the primary plotter. It had been his idea. He'd actually committed the murders himself. Hazel was not quite as culpable, but at the same time, she had done nothing to stop what had happened and had assisted Howell. It couldn't have happened without her.
Hazel just looked completely stunned, bewildered, motionless, and sitting just across from her. I'll never forget her children, her daughter, absolutely devastating, crying out in disbelief. Because even then, they believed that their mother was innocent.
To suffer the death of a mother or a father as a child is probably among the worst things that can happen to someone. To then discover that it was your father or mother who killed them is unimaginable.
The impact statements from the Buchanan family were absolutely devastating. For the family, finding out that Trevor had been murdered, they said was like losing him all over again. And the only comfort that they and Leslie's children had was that they finally had relief, knowing that their loved ones had not deliberately left them. It's hard to put into words just how devastating this was for the evangelical, tight-knit Christian community in Coleraine. Many of these people who were taken in by Howell were the real McCoy. They had spent their lives dedicated to good works. And this guy took advantage of them, and the fallout has been absolutely devastating to this day.
Could he have got away with it? He had got away with it. He'd got away with it for 20 years. Hazel wasn't going to say anything. Nobody would have known the truth unless he had confessed.
All of the main players in this tragedy were people who on the surface looked as if they had it all. And yet, behind the scenes, as the trial exposed, they were no better than any of us.
When Gail met Dr. Birnbaum, he appeared to be the complete package. A doctor, a pilot, speaks languages. Who wouldn't want their daughter marrying that person? They looked like they belonged together. Then she dropped off the face of the earth.
There's no absolute proof that she was dead. It's the where's the body problem.
They can't point to her date of death. They can't exactly say how she died. They can't exactly say when she died. But they have a theory.
I nearly fell out of my chair.
Gail Katz has been missing for a few years.
Gail Katz was somebody who was expressive and was somebody who was creative. She was very, very bright and very motivated.
She was very alive. She was very friendly. She made friends easily.
She was very close with her family. She had siblings that were quite a bit younger than her, but they all looked up to her as a great big sister.
It's clearly the torso of a woman. I'm Dr. Joni Johnston. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist and private investigator. I spend most of my time evaluating violent offenders. This torso is taken to the morgue, and they start looking at it.
The body roughly matched Gail's height and weight, and there are other pieces of evidence that could help suggest this could be her.
One of the things I noticed is there's a certain mark on this torso's rib. And they know that Gail had some kind of unusual formation on one of her ribs. And so they start believing this is Gail.
I'm Dr. Brianna Fox. I'm a criminologist at the University of South Florida in Tampa. They go ahead and declare it as Gail's body and bury it in a ceremony with a headstone, and the family routinely goes to visit Gail's grave with the body that they presume to be of Gail.
It brought closure to the family who had been living with the distress of knowing that their loved one, a family member, had been killed.
Law enforcement can no longer call this a missing persons case. It might be a murder.
The case fizzled out, and it went cold. There was no more investigation to be done. Every step that they could take had been taken. My name is Daniel Bibb. From 1982 to 2004, I was an assistant district attorney in the New York County District Attorney's Office. Andy Rosenzweig was the chief investigator of the disappearance of Gail Katz back in 1985. And for lack of a better word, I think that this case was burning a hole in his head for years. And Andy asked us if we would be interested in assisting in a reopened investigation.
I think her mom had probably a certain ideal that she wanted her daughter to find, somebody who would take care of her, somebody who was ambitious, somebody who was successful.
Robert was impressed by her personality, and she was a very good-looking woman. From all accounts, from people who knew them, they hit it off pretty much right away. When Gail met Dr. Birnbaum, he appeared to be the complete package, someone that Gail's parents would be proud to have marry their daughter.
Robert Birnbaum is a New York native, raised on Staten Island.
Robert, or Bob, as he was called, was somebody who, from the very beginning, was a whiz kid. He was somebody who was brilliant. He not only finished medical school at the age of 22, a lot of people haven't even finished college at the age of 22. He was gifted academically. He could play musical instruments. He spoke 5 languages. He was athletic. He ran on the cross-country team. So, I mean, this is somebody who you look at and kind of go, this is a Renaissance man.
He had a pilot's license and would take her on dates, flying around Manhattan. Gail was at that time a student. She was working odd jobs in Manhattan.
She is just really impressed and, told her friends that even though I've lived here for all my life, I've never seen New York in this way. And so at the very beginning, it's almost like a magical start.
For her, catching somebody like him was a dream, and it seemed like this was just a great fit.
They looked like they belonged together. They acted like they belonged together in public. In private, that was another story entirely.
They move into an apartment, and things are stressful. I mean, Bob is working, 120 hours a week. He is completing his residency. He's kind of in the trenches. And so that would take a lot of energy. And so when he's home, he's tired, he's stressed. And so Gail finds herself probably feeling, on the one hand, lonely and, abandoned in some ways. So there's some bickering that starts.
She was always concerned about their finances. Although they lived in a glamorous Upper East Side building, it was not owned by them. So there were problems from the beginning. The arguments increased over the time they were married, and they got worse and worse and worse.
Even her friends and neighbors started noticing that Robert was extremely controlling. For instance, there were times where Gail would try to just simply turn on a light switch, and if she did, Robert would hit her hand away so he would turn it on. There was literally not a single action that she was able to do without his approval. This was his inability to control his impulses when he saw something that he didn't like.
On one occasion, there was a family dinner where Dr. Birnbaum actually demanded his wife sit on his lap, and then he actually fed her. And when she tried to get up and tried to go sit in her own seat, he would sit her back down on his lap and would continue to feed her.
Then something happens that I think most people would be extremely concerned about.
There was an incident with Gail's cat where Robert did not want the cat around anymore, and he actually tried strangling the cat to kill it. He then tried flushing it down the toilet, and the cat survived.
The reason that he gives for that is he's jealous, and he thinks that Gail loves her cat more than she does Bob.
At this point, Gail said she asked her sister to go with her to take the cat to the animal shelter so it could be adopted, and her sister said to Gail, "Why don't you get rid of Robert and we keep the cat?"
I think that when anybody is threatened by a pet, it's a cause of concern, as it represents this need to control oftentimes, this deep insecurity about themselves. But even more alarmingly, I think it speaks to the capacity for violence. We know oftentimes that individuals who wind up hurting people start out by hurting animals. And so certainly as a forensic psychologist, that is very concerning to me in terms of violence risk. He was extremely bothered by cigarette smoking. And Gail agreed to quit smoking, at least in front of Bob.
She was studying for exams, and she was under such stress that she went out onto their balcony and she smoked a cigarette. When he came home, he realized what she had done and immediately just went from 0 to 100 angry.
He actually strangled her to the point where she lost consciousness.
So the arguments weren't just verbal, they got physical. And the violence was always him on her.
Strangling is one of the biggest red flags in terms of somebody's potential to kill. I mean, if somebody will put their hand around your neck and they will choke you until you pass out, they'll kill you. I mean, that's something that we talk about with domestic violence victims all the time.
As a result of that incident, Gail demands that he see individually a psychiatrist. And he gets to Dr. Stone. And Dr. Stone does an evaluation over a number of visits with Dr. Birnbaum.
He says that after the first session, I thought this guy is a violent psychopath. You know, this guy is so scary to me. And he agrees to see Bob and treat him under some very strict and some very unusual parameters. He asked him to take out a life insurance policy that if Bob Birnbaum hurt Dr. Stone, that Dr. Stone's children would get like $1 million apiece in life insurance, something I've never heard of, you know, as a clinician.
And Dr. Stone feels so strong about Dr. Birnbaum's potential for violence that he drafts what's called a Tarasoff letter. And the Tarasoff letter is basically, it's named after a case from California that basically places a duty on a psychiatrist or any doctor. If a person they believe is violent and can be violent towards a specific individual person, that they warn that person. And in a meeting with Gail, he presented Gail with the Tarasoff letter.
It essentially says, it is my professional opinion that you are in extreme danger, that it is not safe for you to be living with this man, that he's capable of violence, and that if you do not follow my advice, I'd like you to sign this, which basically says, I've warned you.
The only way that she could deal with it is the way she's been dealing with all of Robert's red flags, which is denial. Gail refused to sign, and they stopped going to their therapy sessions with that psychiatrist. She actually decided to consult a divorce lawyer and start proceedings to separate from Robert.
By July of 1985, their marriage was one that was in name only. But both of them, apart from each other, told their friends that there were problems in the marriage. As a matter of fact, he told one of his friends that he was so mad at her that he could kill her. She tells her that she's moving out. She actually has a newspaper in her hand with apartments circled in the newspaper. She's looking for an apartment. She's in love with somebody else. She also tells the friend that I have this letter. I have this letter from his psychiatrist that says he's a danger to me. I can use this as leverage in a divorce proceeding, because obviously he's not going to want that letter to go public. It was our theory of the case that it was that morning that she told him, I want a divorce, I don't love you, I'm in love with someone else, I'm tired of the fights, I'm tired of the arguments, I'm tired of the violence, and by the way, I have this letter that I can use against you.
The next day, she doesn't show up for her practicum, which is very, very important. She's now in graduate school, wanting to get her doctorate, and missing seeing your patients is not something you do lightly. I mean, it's a very serious thing to do. And that is not who Gail was as a person. She was very responsible, very disciplined, very, very involved in her program.
When questioned by the police, Dr. Birnbaum knew that they were suspicious of him. Specifically, in one interview, he actually said to them, you know, this doesn't look right, does it? When a wife disappears or a spouse disappears or a spouse is killed, the other spouse is immediately of concern to the detectives.
Even though he's very open with the fact that they've been having a lot of problems, that she's been very unhappy, that she's been considering divorce, he says that he's very upset and concerned about her welfare, and that's why he decided to come forward and report her missing. Robert tells police every single thing about his day, where he was, the times, locations. He tries to provide information about where he last saw Gail at.
He was very open. They had gone to the movies together. They had cooked dinner together. The next morning, the two of them had gotten into a big argument. At the same time, I think there was some vagueness to his answers in terms of the timeline.
The precinct detective pressed him repeatedly for details. Details that he often would say, I'll get back to you on that. And then he never would. And Detective Dalsas called him at least between 8 and a dozen times over the next week and left messages on his machine. Dr. Birnbaum never called him back.
the search was spearheaded by Gail's family. They were the ones who were kind of making the posters and handing them out.
Robert Birnbaum did almost nothing to assist in finding his wife. The only things he did were at the urging of her parents and her friends and her sister. They had a share in a house in the Hamptons, and he was seen partying at a notorious disco within days of his wife's disappearance. And he continues to go to the Hamptons every weekend that he can. Not only does he go, he brings other women with him and brings them home with him.
The longer that Gail is missing, and I think as Bob becomes less involved in the search for her and kind of moves on in terms of his behavior, I think that it just becomes more and more evident that, you know, Gail's family is very suspicious of him. And so he gets an attorney to protect his interest.
They're thinking as that she may very well be dead already. And of course they're thinking, if she is, Dr. Birnbaum may very well have had a hand in it.
Elaine, particularly Gail's sister, was very suspicious of him, based primarily on the things that Gail had told her about the strangling and about the cat and those kinds of things.
He relates basically the same story, but with some variations. So even his two statements to two detectives days apart were inconsistent from one another.
They began asking him some very difficult questions, such as, have you ever physically harmed her? Did you ever choke her? Have you ever hurt one of her cats? Because he would just say, I don't want to talk about it, or he would change the subject. But he's realizing that the focus is on him and that some of the things that people reported really don't look very good. So he's under the spotlight and he's feeling the heat.
Gail dropped off the face of the earth. Your wife goes missing. You're the last person to see her. You're the last person to talk to her. Nobody in her family has heard from her. Not one of her friends has heard from her.
The case starts cooling off. It was almost unheard of to try anybody for murder where there was no clear evidence the person was dead. Because it was always easy to say, hey, this person isn't even dead. They just ran off with somebody. She had a breakdown. She met somebody else. There's no evidence that she's dead. So this really, really hampered, I think, police.
Well, the investigation stops because two assistant DAs in the Manhattan DA's office take a look and decide that there wasn't enough evidence to proceed any further.
And I think they did have a lot of suspicions relatively early on. Police kind of felt like their hands were tied.
Gail Katz's family definitely think that he has killed her, without a doubt.
For Gail's family, this is the worst case scenario.
The insistence of his friends saying, you can make a life out here. You're a good plastic surgeon. Las Vegas needs good plastic surgeons. So come out and set up a practice, and that's what he does.
One of the things that Robert Birnbaum decided to do when he moved to Las Vegas was to fly down to Mexico every year and help provide plastic surgery for orphans that were either uninsured or didn't have the money to be able to fix the facial deformities that they were born with or received in life.
He really does focus initially on repairing cleft palates or reconstructive surgery after somebody's had breast cancer. He's not really focusing on the big bucks, you know, the things that really bring up the money in.
He becomes a local celebrity, if you will. He is on the news. He has magazine articles about him.
This is somebody who is doing good work here, and at the same time, he's being applauded for this. However, he's not completely changed.
He dated probably just about every female member of the medical community at least once, a number of them for fairly long periods of time. They all ended badly.
But he gets involved with a woman named Stephanie. And Stephanie is very much invested in the relationship, but a couple of red flags come up to her.
She again notices that he has a temper, that he can be very controlling, that he has explosions of rage.
I think at one point she broke a glass accidentally in his apartment, and he just flies into this absolute rage in front of other people. She's like, this is a red flag, and we're gonna go see a therapist and just figure this stuff out. This therapist tells Stephanie, this person is dangerous. You will be at risk if you stay with this person. And so Stephanie ends the relationship. Here's evidence of a body. It's kind of a mixed bag.
up to the trial, we became aware that the defense, part of their defense was going to be that this was
which is a feather in their cap.
I believe Dr. Birnbaum is
and doing the right thing.